Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Terra Prime Live. Darth Anonymous coming to you from Terra Prime headquarters. Today, we are going to be talking about the roots of sabering. So, we have gone through sometimes about some of our backgrounds and all of that kind of thing. But the basic premise is we all know that sabering and lightsaber martial art and all that kind of stuff is a figment of our imagination. It's a thing that has been used as a plot device and as a game mechanic for a long time, but it's never really existed in real life. Obviously, because lightsabers don't exist in real life, so there's not really any use for that kind of thing. However, with the advent of lightsaber technology, with the polycarbonate blade and the in-hilt LEDs and all that kind of stuff, we now have sabers that can act as sword analogs. And sword analog means that it is a stand-in for your sword. A stand-in for your sword will allow you to do things that you maybe cannot do safely with a real sword, or that you simply want to practice it and all of that kind of thing. So, all of that being said, where does all of the stuff that we do come from? Right? We get, obviously, a lot of the talk on the internet is, oh, well, that's not Makashi, that's not Soresu, that's not this, that, and the other, and we constantly give back the very convenient response of, those things don't really exist, so whatever you want, right? But now we're going to talk about exactly where things are coming from, where we can draw from, where we do draw from, and what we can kind of learn from it. So joining me today on the panel, we have our friends Ben and Jared coming to us off of the council, and Roberto and Aro, and Victor coming from Puerto Rico. We are all from traditional slash historical martial arts. We'll get into maybe a little bit of that discussion too, of which one is which, or does it really even matter, especially for what we're doing. But we do represent a good number of years in actual arts and combat sports. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. So obviously, we've said this many times that my background being mainly Chinese, from Taiji to Tongbei to Jian, all of that kind of thing. So a lot of my stuff comes from the Chinese. I won't go into too much of the traditional stuff like the Taiji and the all that. But what I'll do is kind of give you a little background into some things where I'm coming from, and then I'll throw it over to the other guys here, and they can do the same. So as far as the sources that are coming from, that I'm drawing from for the material that I put out there, which of course is just taking my flavor because I'm the one putting it out there. Other people are going to be putting stuff out, and that's going to take on different flavors. But one of the main sources that I do is from a book called the Wu Beizhi, which is, and specifically, a section in it on the two-handed jian. Now, the interesting thing about this particular section is that it was written in about 1620 something, or maybe a little bit before, in China. And even at that time, the two-handed jian was a lost art that they were reconstructing. So this could be considered the oldest historical martial arts manual ever written, because it was already kind of reaching back through that. The Makashi stuff that I have, a lot of that comes from Wudong Jian. Most of that coming from the school of Li Tianji, who is this gentleman here. Again, has a lot of connection to the to modern wushu and to the sport of wushu, and also my current teacher, Ma Yu. The Ma family was actually instrumental in Duanbing, and this is his father's book, my teacher's father's book, Ma Xianda, who was, the instructor for lots of the famous wushu guys in the 70s and the 60s and 70s, Jet Li among them. But there was a fencing sport that they were trying to integrate into the wushu curriculum called Duanbing. And that sport influences a lot of what we do kind of sporting wise in our, in our organization. So that's a little bit of kind of just a little brief thing. We can go into details as we go on. Jared or Ben, do you either of you want to jump in and say kind of how you're approaching it? Maybe Ben. Oh, yeah, there you go.
Sorry, I'm going to unmute my mic there. So yeah, so I also have a Chinese martial arts background. I mean, I've done different martial arts, but probably my biggest interest is in Southern Chinese Kung Fu from the Pearl River Delta region. I'm a Wing Chun student. And, Wing Chun is not a big weapons art. It's mostly boxing, but it does have two weapons. It has a very long pole, like a 3-meter long pole that you use. And it has a set of paired knives or, 2 dao. And in my particular school, one of the things that my Sifu was really, really interested in was kind of a historical reconstruction of those 2 knives. Because as they come down to us, they're not very practical, right? People clearly have not fought with them for a long time. They have a lot of the, they haven't thought very hard about, what the actual applications were in the sets, the forms that we still have. But, my teacher, and this is where you get into the difference between a traditional martial art and a historical martial art, right? So Wing Chun is a traditional martial art, but what he was really interested in was the process of historical reconstruction, right? How do we take this material that has been passed traditionally and kind of spin it backwards and say, well, we know people were actually fighting with, sets of double swords on battlefields in southern China in the 1840s and 50s. We have lots and lots of historical accounts. How would that have worked, right? And so that got me interested in the more historical reconstructive side of things. And that's where I really developed my love of fencing, right? Because most Wing Chun guys do not have a love of fencing. They're boxers. But I'm one of these few Wing Chun people who seems to have ended up with a real love of kind of more practical fencing. And so for me, all of this fits in rather nicely as it helps to fill out that picture for, what would different types of Chinese swordsmanship have looked like in practice? And then how do I train a classroom full of people with lightsabers that I can practice on? Right. Specifically, I can say I'm doing quote unquote Jar Kai as I get out my Wing Chun double swords and just take people apart, which is so much fun.
Yes, of course. And that's really when it comes down to whether we are coming from a traditional background or a historical background, whether we want to say that we are doing things historically or traditionally or realistically or whatever. Really what it comes down to is we just want to fight with swords. That's about what it comes down to. So Jared, how would you where are you at with the, because I know you come from a very rich background, so you'll be drawing on a lot of different things.
Well, I'm can you hear me okay?
Yep.
My mic is being weird. So I'm one of those unusual guys who's both a fencer and a boxer. Um, I competed in boxing for give or take 3 years. I trained at a Japanese boxing school by an old school boxing trainer who then had me reading kung fu manuals, which was always a pretty interesting application in the ring. Um, but I also on the other side of my coin is that I'm a traditional Japanese guy, not a Japanese guy, obviously, hence the accent, but traditional Japanese martial arts, which unlike a lot of the Chinese traditions, don't have that rich, literature behind them. There are very few manuals in the annals of Japanese martial arts. Instead, anything that you see, like if you get on eBay and you're looking for old scrolls or whatever, it's usually just licenses. It will be a list of techniques that this person is approved to teach to other people. And that's about the extent of it. Um, I primarily train in a school called the Shinkage style, and there is one really famous document called the Heiho Kadensho, um, which is written almost entirely in code. And if you're not extensively trained in the school, it seems like complete gibberish when you read it. There are a few translations, some better than others, but I mean, you can go pick this thing up at Barnes and Noble. It's usually, I think the title is The Life-Giving Sword, and you can see for yourself. It doesn't make a lick of sense when you actually pick it up and try to read it. They're talking about like the shoe presenting bridge and things like that. It's gobbledygook. Um, so I was always a little bit envious of Chinese arts that have, all these manuals with diagrams and instructions and things like that. Um, and that actually set me looking back at Western fighting manuals and Jack Dempsey and then some of the older fisticuff stuff and trying to find out why did boxing change so much over the years, only to discover that it's all because of rules and equipment. Um, so then I went off on a few years lark of doing bartitsu and things like that, getting into old school like prize fighting style training, which seems to be making a resurgence in recent years, and I'm very glad for that because smaller gloves. Uh, Plus, with the recent advent, well, not advent, but approval of bare knuckle boxing as a professional sport, it's causing people to train pretty radically differently than they have been for a few years with standard boxing or even MMA rules. So I kind of have the modernist and traditionalist approach that sort of ran into each other over time. Personally, I blame that on my parents letting me save money and buy Bruce Lee's Training Methods by Lee and Uehara back in like 1993 or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Now I will just I'll mention this, and me and Ben, you'll probably want to talk about this a little bit more later too. Is that while we do have many manuals from like the Republican era and stuff like that, and the Ming Dynasty, um, the information in these manuals is definitely difficult to get to. Um, like you said, there's a lot of code. Like there's a lot of military idioms that just would have been understood by readers back
Poetry.
then.
So much freaking poetry.
Yes, and then there's the Chinese tradition of writing instructions in verse, um, which makes so they sacrifice clarity for meter and rhyme and all kinds of stuff and imagery, and it can get pretty dense. So they yeah, I mean, it's always a trade-off. You got historical documents, you've got traditional lineage. Traditional lineage is living, so it's totally not the same as what came before. The historical documents are incomplete, so they don't give you a real good picture of what came before. So we're here. And I will mention that what we are doing in TPLA, taking these traditional arts, applying them to a new weapon, a new kind of milieu, something like that, is something that has happened in martial arts, and it continues to happen in martial arts over and over and over and over and over again through history. This is certainly not the first time it's happened, and I doubt it will be the last. especially now with all that's going on. Anyway, but before we get to that, why don't we head on over to our twins, the twin sons over there. You guys are a kendo school as well, right? So the sport of kendo.
Yes, sir. Actually, our main background, since we're all siblings, we pretty much all come from the same school. Victor, Roberto, and me, we're siblings. We started on traditional karate, and our teacher actually taught karate, Aikido, and Kenjutsu, and Kobudo, which is the weapons part of Okinawan karate. So it was very much traditional, not what is now called Gendai Budo, which would be the modern Budo, what Kendo is, but kind of like very traditional, historical martial arts. And we transitioned into Kendo about 8 to 9 years ago, because in Puerto Rico there wasn't that many traditional schools that would do sword fighting, and we found a kendo group that would take us in, and we started training kendo about 8 years ago. I make the distinction because, like you said, there is a gap between what traditional martial arts and their goal, and modern martial arts and sports martial arts and their goal. In traditional martial arts, you're trying to pass down teaching from the past and techniques that would work on a quote unquote real fight or a battlefield in the historical context that they were created. Whereas in modern martial arts, you're trying to prolong a game or a set of rules which make for a completely different context, like doing techniques that would be traditional and on a sporting arena wouldn't make for a very good sport, because mainly most fights would be finished with 1 or 2 cuts and then you'd be done with. And there wouldn't be any way to either prolong or do subsequent matches after performing those techniques. So the difference between traditional martial arts, which have things that have been passed down just because they were taught a certain way or they're preserving a tradition, which may no longer serve any purpose in the modern world, whereas modern and sporting variants of the tradition might keep evolving based on the rules or whichever way you wanna take the sport to perpetuate that new tradition. Like you were saying, we play with lightsabers, which is basically a analog for a sword. In Kendo, we use the shinai, which is also an analog for a sword. It's a bamboo stick that we use so that you don't kill your friends when you're bashing on them with what would be a sword. So in our tradition, we have integrated Kendo, and we have steered a little bit more towards Kendo now. But in our upbringing, we started with very traditional, very historical Japanese martial arts. Roberto or Victor, do you want to add anything else? I tend to ramble on. So.
That's pretty good, I would say. And we just have a new member to the thing here. So Jeff, you're coming from a traditional Japanese background in what style do you do? I'm not.
Yeah, sure. First off, I'm sorry I'm late, guys. I just saw the thing, but I came in and it was already a great conversation. I was already engaged. Right up my alley is things to talk about. Loving it. Yeah, my parent art is an art, by the way, steeped in no end of controversy as to its legitimacy, about issues about Koru, as well as combat effectiveness, etc. my parent art is the Bujinkan tradition, rife with, controversy, rightfully so, a lot of its positions. But I also have an investment in Yanagi-ryu, which is most likely a Minkyo Kaiden variant of Daido-ryu, and also Toyama-ryu, which is really interesting all by itself because it's not a true Ko-ryu. It's actually a modern military art derived from Ko-ryu. That's not the Japanese side. I also have pretty heavy investment at this point in Hema, mostly Italian. But those are my loves. But the conversation was spot on as far as really interesting. For what it's worth, it's been about 30 years now since I started all this stuff. And I also have an investment in modern combatives, right? So modern use of force issues, baton work, OC chemical weapons, tactical folding knife, etc. All that being said, the conversation is spot on about the lightsaber as a martial art and what purposes it serves, and the difference between what's commonly called Budo versus what's commonly called Bujitsu. Both those terms are arbitrary because there's more cross use of them than is acknowledged. But to speak in generalities, for the sake of conversation, we can say there's the modern Budos, and we can sort of say there's the Ko-ryu of the Bujitsu. All those points, are valid because there's combat interpretations, there's individual interpretations. And I use as an example Aikido, which is an art I'm fond of, and Sensei Ueshiba, also a historical person I'm fond of. But he did certain things that fit him. He was only 4'11". And if you're 4'11", you already have an extraordinarily low center. And so there's things that you don't have to do as a short person that you do have to do as far as lowering your center as a tall person. And I just bring that as an example, but all this stuff is so wonderful. And I said before how much I like TPLA because it takes this in a kind of lighthearted way. It takes this kind of historical approach because look, we're not actually going to defend ourselves with lightsabers. We're not fighting wars with lightsabers. We aren't doing any of those things. It's worthwhile to apply that thinking to lightsaber as a martial art to add substance as a martial art. But it's not. I mean, we're not going to actually fight with these things for real. In fact, if we use them correctly, the polycarbonate blades absorb most of the damage. To actually hurt someone with a lightsaber, you have to use it incorrectly.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing too, because the idea of reality and what you're going to do and all of that. When I started this project, when me and Matt started this project, we got lots of derision from our peers and stuff like that because it's just, and I still do. It's a lightsaber. Oh, it's just a toy. You're playing with toys and all that kind of stuff. And, quite frankly, if you really get down to it, if you're using a sharp sword that is, like a reproduction of like the LK Chens that we're getting now, I'm sorry, you're playing with an expensive, dangerous toy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we don't use swords anymore. We are so separated from sword culture. I mean, by years, by time, and by technology, that our little hobby of playing with these stores is so incomplete and such a tiny sliver of what it must have been back in the day. We think of things back in the day as like, okay, well, swordsmen were this way and swordsmen were this way. No, swordsmen were every way. There were probably people who were just complete dullards with a sharpened iron bar, and then there are people who are human Cuisinarts. You're going to see the whole thing. Back when it was commonplace, though, when things are commonplace, they're also unremarkable. So a lot of times people don't talk about them as important, right? So in both cultures, in Western culture and Eastern culture, and Ben, maybe you can speak to this a little bit more. There have there's been a general lack of interest in the martial arts, in the history of martial arts, in weaponry, in the training of weaponry and all that, in favor of military strategy, in favor of, battles and all of that kind of thing. Is that something, Ben, you want to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, again, it takes us a bit away from Star Wars, but I mentioned that, as I and my Sifu, as we were working on, researching the, the double knives that you see in Wing Chun, there's no information. There's no 18th, early 19th century information about these in the Chinese language. I mean, there are a couple of vanishingly brief references, so that they exist. But other than that, there's nothing. If you want a description of how these things are used, it turns out the best place to get that is in English military reports and French newspapers and Russian newspapers, because if something was commonplace, this was a very commonplace weapon. It was given to every security guard in every warehouse in southern China, right? Nobody was writing this down. It was not at all remarkable. The only people who thought it was remarkable enough to describe how people trained with these and how people fought with these were French military officers who were showing up saying, "What the hell is this?" They wrote quite extensively about it because it was so bizarre from their perspective, right? And so, very often when you're trying to do this kind of, historical reconstructive research, the sources that turn out to be the most valuable are not the ones that you would naturally think. Chinese military records are not particularly valuable for figuring out, how peasant militias fought with their weapons. But, British intelligence reports and French military reports, those are actually really valuable for figuring out exactly what, Chinese soldiers were really doing with their weapons.
Yeah. And that's one of the freedoms that we have here with doing the lightsaber. We can kind of historically reconstruct these things, but we're not married to the history anymore, right? We have carte blanche to go off on, well, maybe they didn't do it that way, but we're going to do it that way, and you may, you may cheer or whinge at that. I don't know, but it's sort of happening in HEMA. There've been a couple of videos out that have talked about HEMA losing its way or becoming gatekeepery or anything like that. But Star Wars fans, you're talking to the experts in gatekeeping here. Yeah, you guys got a long way to go before you catch up with us. But anyway, but it shows, like, you have people who are not relying on manuals and not relying on historical research. They're relying on the fruits of those previous researchers, right? And so it's become a sport in and of itself. You don't have to actually have any contact with a historical manual to practice HEMA or to practice the sport of HEMA. So you can go compete at swordfish or whatever, as long as you have the appropriate weapon and the appropriate gear and everything is all right with the rules. And so now there's kind of like a divide. It's natural, right? Martial arts are utilitarian systems, and they serve purposes, not just for fighting. I'm going to push back on that. There's this reigning theory out there that a martial art, in order to be a martial art, has to be about fighting. It does not have to be about fighting. There are plenty of performative martial arts which are based on fighting, which aren't fighting in and of themselves. I'm not going to tell Yen Wu Ping that he is not doing martial arts, just because he's doing stage combat. It's all, these, and that's something that's modern to us, right? We're not married to these things. I'm not a soldier who has to make sure that I'm doing things in the soldierly fashion, right? I can do it in whatever fashion I kind of feel like at the time, right? I'm not a duelist in the Han Dynasty who has to, depend on a particular set of skills with weapons and all that kind of thing.
Well,
So,
but the really important thing to realize, I think, is that you don't have to have anything remotely like a martial art to get all of the skills that you need to train a soldier to be pretty freaking deadly and efficient. I mean, Japanese warriors were murdering each other with swords for a long time before they invented the first sword-based martial arts in Japan, because we know when that happened, and people had been murdering each other for a long time prior to that, right? So again, it does make you ask yourself, well, wait a second, what exactly is my goal with going from, just training a bunch of guys in a camp and how to sword fight to creating this other type of social community? And
right.
that can help lightsaber groups, right? You're only helped when you sit back and say, hey, wait a second, what are my actual goals here? What is the actual goal of my organization that I am trying to promote? Because it's probably not, ultimate badassery. That's never really your ultimate goal.
Right. Or if it is, it's ultimate badassery within a particular context.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But it's like, basically, how do you get from here, from military manual to here, a sport? Right. I'm not sure that my theory and how it kind of worked in China a little bit is that you have a lot of people who started getting conscripted into the military, which was sort of a different type of thing. They all then went back to their villages or whatever after they did their thing and are teaching other people. And so you start to see a proliferation of names and, kind of things going around out there. But we had, like Jared was mentioning, in Chinese and in Europe, Europe really has most of the written material on martial arts. Honestly, the treatises are much more detailed, all of that stuff. A lot of the stuff, like Ben was saying, the Ming Dynasty stuff is very military oriented. So is it a martial art? I don't know. Is 6 stances a martial art? I don't know.
Really valid points. If I could interject, I think a good way to study and to think about that, and one of the things that I value in my own personal life experience is we can sort of understand, these historical martial arts through the lens of modern combat sciences. I mean, everything you're saying is spot on. When you're trying to institutionally train someone, that's different. It's one thing to have a master-student relationship extending over decades, that it's individual and small group. It's another thing entirely to present an institutional format where you're trying to train thousands of people just as an argument. And I think to go back to, and I may have missed the first part of the question, but going from the science, the military science, the jutsu to the do, I think we can do both. And I think that's sort of why I like the TPLA format, is because if there are people who just want to pursue this as a path and want nothing to do with actually fighting, they can. The context is there to do it. To, like, Yado, no one's fighting that for sure, but you can study it as a path. And so in some ways, I think the lightsaber becomes a Budo 2.0, if you will, and that it again is offering the pursuit of these martial disciplines even one more step removed from the original context, because as we all know, younger people today almost knee-jerk reject orthodoxy. And I was able to attract far more people waving glow sticks than I was waving katana or any other historical weapon, because
yeah, I mean, it's an unfair competition, right?
Right.
Ours light up. They make sound, right? Yeah, come on. And people have said, look, if we set up two things, swords over here, lightsabers over here, guess who's getting more people?
Right.
I'm sorry. We've definitely got the better weapon.
It becomes a skillful means to reach people because, and perhaps this is, naive optimism on my part, but I always saw a lightsaber as a potential two-way door, right? So the people doing historical stuff, many of which were inspired, if they're our age, by the original Star Wars to get into sword arts, can now move from the historical sword arts to actually applying their skill set with the glow stick, and vice versa. People who are inspired by the lightsaber can then start looking backwards in time, say, hey, if I want to get particularly better at this, where does this come from? What are some other ways to develop this particular, mechanic, technique, lightsaber form, whatever? Because lightsaber is, in a way, a kind of a buffet of historical arts, not a single one. Depending on the teacher and the path, etc.
Yeah.
So there's value in that.
Yeah. Now, the other thing we can talk about, and welcome, Xander, just you come in here, is in traditional arts, in historical arts, as we kind of like this kind of separate these two here. Historical arts are generally based on some sort of historical document, right? Sure. You can expand that to make historical arts or anything that's trying to be reconstructed from history, whether they're taking information from archaeology or something like that. That's sort of a different term. That's more of a kind of like a genre, so, arts that are meant to do that. And that would include reenactment and reconstruction and all of that kind of thing. Little bit different than historical martial arts, which are usually based on some sort of historical document. Doesn't necessarily have to be a manual, but something. Traditional arts, we have a much more convoluted and dumb way of doing it, which is lineage.
An oral tradition.
Yeah. So lineage meaning your teacher's teacher, their teacher's teacher, yada, 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 all the way, on down. Now, this is basically like a centuries-long game of telephone. So, lineages, while they are important to arts and stuff like that, there's a lot of confusion on it, and a lot of times I think they're given a little too much weight, right? And I think everybody would say they're given a little bit too much weight. Right. It doesn't really matter who you came from or whatever. It could, right? There's definitely people in different, like if you learn painting from, Tammy Wynette, big deal, right? You learn singing from Tammy Wynette, okay, bigger deal. So, anyway, but so on the concept of lineage with what we do here, obviously we want to give some sort of notice to our forebearers, but we don't necessarily have to. We can create lineage the way we want it, because these are fictional characters that we can say that we are basing all of this kind of stuff on. And that brings up a kind of an interesting point. And I wanted to throw this over to you, Jared, to open up this discussion. The importance of lineage for me, it doesn't necessarily seem to be the actual recording of who's who and when's when and who's coming from who, but more, kind of like a family tree, something of origin, that can impart some sort of connection between practitioners, which I think can happen in this scenario as well.
I would argue it's more the rule than the exception. Jeff made a good point earlier talking about Morihei Ueshiba and the invention of Aikido. Aikido has very little historical basis. It draws on a school that was invented within the lifetime of a guy slightly older than Ueshiba. That's it. Now, whether or not Daitoryu Aikijujutsu actually has like ancient lineage, no, historically, we've pretty much figured that one out. It's largely just he kind of invented stuff as he went along. Whether or not there's anything wrong with that, that's up to the individual to decide, I guess. It's like, what is effectiveness or what is legitimate? It depends on the rules of the game you're playing. But if we look at this, not just in a martial arts context or what have you, but broader historical context, it has been extremely common over time. I'm putting on my anthropologist hat now. It's been incredibly common over time that we would often say you would legitimize a piece of writing or a piece of information by claiming it was created by someone else who was more famous. We say that like Homer wrote the Odyssey, but Homer, if he existed at all, would have been a blind person. Like the act of sitting down and writing this would not have been accessible to him. He was supposedly a blind, illiterate poet who went around memorizing passages. So whoever actually wrote that wasn't Homer, but attributes it to Homer because that adds an air of legacy and legitimacy and ties it into someone that the writer admired. And in martial arts, we see this the same, whether you're in Europe or the New World or anywhere at all, they're going to be tying these histories and new invented traditions. They'll sort of staple them on to the coattails of very famous people. We see this in the Japanese arts all the time. If you go back far enough in most schools, they will attribute the creation of a style to a particular deity or a monkey, in my own case.
Or Tengu, my favorite.
Yeah, Tengu. Like if you, I've spent a lot of nights on mountains where supposedly Tengu taught people martial arts. And I could see where, if you hang out on Mount Kurama long enough, you could kind of get freaked out by the sounds up there. It's a strange place. But yeah, that sort of thing happens constantly throughout history. And it's not even like this is something relegated to the past. If you actually sit down and listen to interviews with popular MMA fighters right now, they say some kooky dook stuff about where they learned to do things. Anderson Silva learned a front kick from Steven Seagal. Really? Are we all going to just play that game? I'm fine with it.
Easier to substantiate credentials, or it takes less time and effort to substantiate credentials than it is to take the time to prove the weight of the contents that you have on your hand. Therefore, it's a lot faster to be able to say you have the credentials on one hand from A, B, C, and D, and I've got the character stamped document that says that I'm of the lineage of so and so. That it is to actually take the time and go through all your techniques, and somebody's attention span will go away before you've actually demonstrated what's actually on your hands, on your mind, on your heart.
This is true, but I do have to point out, if we're looking at this from just a purely academic stance, this is not necessarily a bad thing. See, in our modern context, if somebody says, this came to me from, I don't know, Winston Churchill or whatever, and puts the idea out there to legitimize it, that's one thing. That's abject lying and deceitfulness. But in past contexts, in terms of what culture we're operating in at the time, because culture is not just a geographic issue, it's also a temporal issue. Like past people who lived in the same place you do, your own ancestors, had very different cultures. And in past cultures, for the most part, wherever you are in the world, it was acceptable and common and seen as a good thing to say Alexander the Great wrote this thing and that's why we have it. He didn't actually write that. He never knew it existed. But by tying it back to him, that's you're willing to put yourself out there even and say, this is how much I value this, that I'm going to claim it was him. So it's important that we not overly moralize these kinds of things too, because relative to the culture you're in, nobody's trying to be a bad guy, with the exception of Chael Sonnen, who, he called his company Bad Guy Incorporated. That's
right,
intentional, but for the most part.
Yes. And that's, again, that's one of the things that we're free of when we're dealing with fictional biographies and, all that. We can come up with our things, and about the culture thing, and about specifically about authorship. The Chinese tradition since the Ming Dynasty has been that it is absolutely permissible and almost laudable to take somebody's writing whom you admire and reproduce it word for word in your publication. This book here, the Jishao Sun Shu, is pretty famous amongst Chinese practitioners, especially now. It's getting really popular. Everybody's taking stuff from it, and because certain pieces are getting, translated. I'm doing a couple myself. But within it, we have the entire text of a guy named Yu Dayu's Jianjing, or Sword Classic. It is reproduced word for word, copied, and then given a couple of illustrations at the end. That then was in turn copied and put in the collection of the Wu Beizhi, which I mentioned earlier. And the interesting thing is recently, as I was translating it and kind of going back and forth, Mao Yanyi, who wrote the Wu Beizhi, must have copied it from the copy, because there's a typo in here when he's doing it, and that typo transfers over. So yeah, you will. Oh, right. And then there's this. This is from the Republican era, so this is 1930s or whatever. This is essentially that sword thing that I told you about, right, with new illustrations and some little explanations. But yeah, they just straight up copying, right? That obviously still goes on today with Chinese knockoffs, and that's why, because it's just, they take the whole imitation is the highest form of flattery thing really to the nth degree on that one. But yeah, so that's something to keep in mind, right? That people attribute authorship to things. People will reproduce things. I heard somebody post, and you see this a whole lot now with the internet. Somebody posted something about Mulan being a real person, and then you read the thing in Mulan and nothing is correct, right? They're like, wait a second. If you were that into Mulan, have you only seen the Disney movie? Is that where you learned about Mulan? Because for those of you who don't know, spoiler alert, The Legend of Mulan is mostly based on an old ballad, which is very short. I can't remember how many stanzas it is, but it's just boop, 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 and that's it. It's pretty short. And then of course over the years they've made lots of stories over it.
You mean Mushu the dragon didn't really exist?
No, unfortunately not.
Oh, you just broke my heart.
Yes. However, if you read Chinese literature, there are things far more bizarre and hilarious than Mushu the dragon, especially saying like Journey to the West or something. Things get pretty bonkers.
Unfortunately, he's made up, unlike Iago the parrot, who was a real historical person. More contemporary, I would point out that almost none of those famous sayings attributed to Bruce Lee are originally from Bruce Lee. He was a very big fan of doing this exact thing, and stealing from everything from classic Zen writings to modern self-help books. The man was obsessed with self-help books. We know this extensively. His library is filled with, Jim Rohn stuff, Richest Man in Babylon and Napoleon Hill and all these things. And he would take them line for line. Some of it he didn't even originally steal himself. It was taken by Hollywood writers, like the B. Waters speech, right? That was written for him. And then he just memorized it and repeated it. And because he was a really good actor, it sort of worked for him. But all of this simplify, or the classical mess, he didn't invent any of that stuff. but now we can attribute it to him because he's the big name who became associated with it. Same thing with the martial arts.
Yeah, just to add to what Jared's saying, it struck me how much, and I forget he's an anthropologist, but it struck me how much all that is also true with religion. When we look at, theological positions and the pseudopedagogical, the same arguments or thing people attribute, just to use Abrahamic religions, people attribute writings to Paul that were never written by him, or his name gets attached on. And it's interesting how those two histories between religion and martial arts so often overlap with one another, depending on the culture. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, this constant co-option and plagiarizing. Maybe one way to look at that is positive evolution. That something's good and it keeps selling well, so it keeps getting proffered.
Well, that's an interesting question, because we're open source here, right? So we share our stuff out there, and obviously that invites people to imitate and all that. Now we have Creative Commons, so we can pretty much ask for something in return. The only thing that we ask is that you just say where you got it, right? So that's in the spirit of, we do understand that, but it's definitely, it's one of those things about culture that I think a lot of people take for granted and don't think about.
I think it's really interesting, and also that on that, not necessarily plagiarizing, but adopting and seeing the seams. Like you mentioned, the typo on the Chinese document. Some of those may not be typos, some of those may be different interpretations, and you can see where the intent of something may have shifted, or may be better explained one way or the other. I didn't really understand the Makashi one until I saw Darth Razor, his video when he was doing, because it came from a different angle. I could see it from the top down when he recorded his video. So the different kind of seams on the interpretation from the TPLA video and Razor student submission kind of gave me a different insight on things that I hadn't really seen when I was trying to study one of the source documents. Seeing some of the students now Knights doing their interpretation of it kind of enriched my understanding of, oh, this is why these angles work, and this is why I'm thinking Makashi as a duelist, Olympic fencing straight forward and back, and all of a sudden it opened an entire gamut of angles in front of me.
Yeah, so this is not the typo I'm talking about, and the phenomenon I'm talking about is not that at all. What it actually does is it does the opposite. So in this particular typo, the phrase is Yao Li, which means waist strength. That's the original thing. So the original line reads, waist strength will win the day, blah, blah, blah. Basically, you're coming in and you want to use your waist, all that kind of thing. Well, the character for strength, Li, right, looks very, very much like the character for saber, Dao, right? And one, as it transferred over, turned into Yao Dao, which is an actual weapon, right? So now the interpretation of that phrase can be your waist saber, which is what a sidearm would be, right, will win the day. Changing the entire, kind of intent, right? It's not, and my point about that is that just because you're reading something in a source or anything like that, is going to be a very rare person who will look this kind of crap up in this much detail, spend this much time cross-referencing things, right? So most people are never going to encounter those things. Therefore, you don't want to put too much weight on how correct things are and what the lineage is kind of specifically, or what the authorship is, because things change, not just through reasonable ideas and stresses, but sometimes just because somebody made a mistake. Or in our friend John's famous story about the cutting the ham in half mystery, he finally found out why his family cut the pan in half, or ham in half. He went to his great grandmother and she said the pan was too small. That's it. So it could be that. Anyway, okay. Anybody have anything else they want to kind of add here? I want to see if we
just to wrap up. I think it is stunning the degree to which martial arts and Star Wars enrich each other. That it is so much easier to understand the weirdness of the Jedi Order if you actually have been involved in lineage martial arts. Likewise, it is amazing, that the pseudo history that, you're making there tracks so well with how real historical processes actually tend to play out.
Yeah, definitely. And, we've talked about this before when we started we started the shows on the forms, that the forms themselves, as they're put out narratively, right? And so there's a continuity to them, but that continuity just kind of naturally falls into the continuity that history kind of falls into. You start with crude battling, you get into the one-on-one type of thing, and then you start to fine tune everything out of there, and then things change, attitudes, purposes, right? So we've got all of this stuff now here with the lightsaber. We now have our own purpose. We have a purpose of sport. We have a purpose of just practice, of looking cool with these new weapons, of it. Well, in some cases, it's people are doing this just to make themselves feel better for spending so much money on a lightsaber. And I'm all for that. All right. If you buy an expensive lightsaber, you might as well use it. And if you follow our stuff at home and want to get involved with us and all that kind of stuff, we can definitely teach you how to do that, and send you off into the world with all kinds of that stuff out there. Anyway, all right. Do we have any other final thoughts before we end the show for the evening?
Just to add a little bit to what Ben was saying, I also am no end grateful for both the inspiration of Star Wars when I was a kid, and the Jedi and all that stuff. And, it fed my imagination. In my mind, when you feed the imagination, you feed the soul. But on top of that, the opportunity lightsaber provides for us to reach audiences we wouldn't, and also to kind of have this perennial tradition of the sword, to focus on these cultural universals. It's an organic process. It's all still, in the make, but, by being, we can't have legitimate arguments about historicity, obviously. So that's off the table. So we get to adhere to any historicity we want, to include these multiple traditions. So in this cool way, we become a doorway by our pseudo historical way of attaching to them, to these other traditions, in a way of preserving them, or at least as an access point to them. And then the reverse is true. As a swordsman, and everybody here is a swordsman, I've loved the historical sword. You don't get to always pursue them all at once. You're in your little box, for that culture, that tradition, that time when you're studying something. So the lightsaber in this weird way gives us an opportunity to look at multiple boxes at the same time. And I appreciate that, because I always wanted to do that, because it's the Gladius Universalis. We get to apply any operational system to it we want to, if we give it its magic blade rule set. And so I'm grateful for that, grateful for this. And I really believe in this historical ambiance approach, for lack of a thing to call it. Because it does, we can do all of that. We can be tournament fighters if you want. We can pursue this thing like it's Aikido if we want, or we can pursue it like it's Bujitsu if we want. All of those, and choreography, all of those things are acceptable, and there's no reason why we shouldn't try to do them all, or at least provide the foundation for people who want to do them.
So this has kind of become my refrain for everybody in TPLA, but don't forget to pleasure test what you're doing outside of work. If you're not having fun, why are you doing this?
Right.
Just enjoy yourself and move your body a little, guys. That's the only legitimate thing you need to do.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to add on a little bit more when we were talking about lineage, and I think that it also brings that kind of like family tree thing to it. So if we were to apply the lineage part of it to Lightsaber and what we're doing, it kind of gives you.
You still there?
I'm sorry, it got cut off. Who knew who actually interacted with who, and it kind of gives you that little family tree thing of knowing like, well, we have this connection to other people and other things, which I think is absolutely fantastic about what we're doing now with Lightsaber. It allows us to connect on a very intellectual level with a whole bunch of different people that we wouldn't have access to any other way. So I think it's a wonderful, thing for the community building in terms of what TPLA is doing and opening the door for us to experiment and reach out and touch each other on various different disciplines throughout time and space.
Very true. Yes, Xander, I know you came in kind of late. You haven't want to say anything before we take off for the evening?
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole aspect of the lineage thing is coming from my martial art, and there's no historical documents of half of Taiko Ayada's history actually existing, like grandfathers that didn't exist and stuff like that. Taking that and just saying, well, it's just fiction. I mean, that relieves a lot of that pressure of when people say, where are you coming from, that you can just study the art. And forgot where I was going with that, but yeah, that's basically it relieves the pressure of that, so you can just study it and have fun with it.
Well, yeah, that's what Jared is encouraging everyone to do. This is something this is again something that is new to us, to our generation, and new to it's something that rarely happened in martial arts, to a certain extent, just because of technology and all of that. Yes, we have instances of it in Europe and in China and stuff like that, of literati getting into fencing and martial arts and all that kind of thing and playing around with it. But we today do martial arts primarily for pleasure, right? Whether it be sport, cultivation, whatever. It's an entertainment and a leisure activity. Anybody that says, different. I mean, because even if you're in the military, and we have a few military people here, as we said, military arts had different than martial arts, right? I mean, military arts are very focused and they're very efficient, and they're supposed to keep, soldiers alive and keep things moving forward, right? They have a pretty narrow goal. So doing martial arts, especially sword-based martial arts and all that, it's a new thing for us. It's just for fun. We've now got things that we don't have to kill each other with, all of that. Yeah. And swords have kind of traditionally always been this type of thing, right? We like to say, you know, battlefield, this, that, and the other, and you know, very few swords were battlefield weapons. They were sort of battlefield weapons, but they certainly weren't the primary ones. So, anyway, I guess that is it for us tonight. Thank you all for being on the program here on the panel. Thank you to everybody who is tuning in at home. We will be back soon, probably next week. You know, very few swords were, and well, we will be next week, but I'll tell you what the show will be here sometime during the week. Anyway, from all of us here at TPLA, thank you for tuning in. Patience, practice, perseverance. Happy sabering.